Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Chance and Choice, Significant Moments in Oregon Shakespeare Festival History, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Latgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'm going to hand it off to Larry.
Good morning, and I'd like to welcome you all to another session of Windows in Time. On behalf of the Joint Committee representing Southern Oregon Historical Society and Jackson County Library Services. Upcoming is next month's talk, which is particularly interested with a strong local topic like today's. Ken Gregg from Jacksonville is a professional photographer, and he was inspired by the beautiful portrait work, creative work of Peter Britt and his son Emil at the end of the last century, of the end of the 19th century, in photographing the transition in Jacksonville from a mining town to the 20th century. He has then taken photographs, stylized photographs of today, which reflect the same spirit as the Brit photographs, and has put them together into a magnificent presentation. So you're all invited to be here for that as well, and that takes place on April 5th. Our talk today, and we're really excited to have her because she's a new face here, is Amy Richards. Amy hails from Buffalo, New York. Her background is in history and in education. And for 20 years, she was the go-to person of Oregon Shakespeare Festival's public relations. She's has access to their wonderful files, insights into their founding and the philosophy behind it and the many great things they've done. And with that, I'm happy to introduce her. Amy.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And okay, so you've had a chance to read the quote up here. And I think you'll all agree that OSF in its almost 88-year history has many significant moments. And so in 45 minutes or less, I need to go through these significant moments. So I have used Angus's memoir as my guide. And I'm going only up to 1970, if I can get there in this amount of time. And that quote intrigues me. It has always intrigued me. And so I wanted to kind of look at how accident, coincidence, and fate played this part in shaping OSF. The right time, right place moments that moved Angus and the festival forward, the unexpected changes in plans and subsequent decisions that did the same thing. And even in this case, some decisions by the bureaucracies of the federal government that hugely impacted Angus and OSF. So with that, we begin with the creation story. And I put 1930 here, but we have to go back in time because if we're going to talk about fate, we must talk about family. And as Angus put it, the genetic and psychological potpourri that he inherited from his family. And this is his grandmother and grandfather Bomer, obviously, and his father. Unfortunately, I didn't have a good picture of his mother. But one of the things about this family is they were very talented. very musical, and they all sang, they played instruments, they were performers, they performed, they created their own performances for their churches, their communities. They also participated in those performances when the community had them. And so I think that Angus was in his first performance when he was 6. He could have been younger than that. So it was in his blood. It was definitely in his blood. He always felt, though, that his family was way more talented in that way than he was. So in giving of their talents to communities, they also gave in newspapering. His grandfather started 16 community newspapers over 64 years of newspapering. And his grandmother, who reared 4 children, also participated. She worked in the print shop, and his father was a newspaper guy. And the reason they started all these newspapers was to build community. They might go into a town that had crossroads, and they come up with an idea that maybe they should have a paved road, maybe they should have a school, maybe they should have a library, whatever it was. And then they would build a newspaper, they would build community spirit. And when Grandpa felt like the job was done, he'd move on to another community. And Grandma told Angus, if you give to society, society will reward you. And Angus was like age 10. He thought, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do something really important, but I'm not really as good as my family at some of these things. So I have to find a niche. I have to find this niche where I can do it really well. And if nobody else is doing it, then I'll be the best. And so he didn't know what that something else was, but he was determined he was going to do something. So giving to the community, incredibly important. And then the third thing I wanted to share was the story that Angus relates that I think really shows a lot about his determination and perseverance. And evidently when he was in high school, his mother had a summer where she wasn't feeling very well. And the doctor suggested that they needed to have a porch swing, and they should put it outside, and she should sit in the fresh air, and this would help her. And they were, okay, well, they didn't have a porch swing, and they didn't have the money for a porch swing. They were not a wealthy family at all. They lived pretty poorly. I mean, they lived well, but they didn't have much money, is what I mean to say. And so anyway, they prayed about this. They didn't know how they were going to get this swing. So they went to the church and they prayed and they shared this need. And in the meantime, while they have an anticipation that this is going to happen, Angus's father builds a brick foundation underneath their cherry tree. And so he's doing this. And then one night at dinner, there's a knock on the door, open the door, and sure enough, here's a group of young people with a swing. They've heard of the need, they've pooled their resources, and they've brought this swing. So not only do they have the swing, the foundation is already built. And so Angus uses this, and he says in his memoir, thank God we started the festival in 1935 and didn't wait for a government grant. But I also think it shows how Angus had this belief, and he was going to move forward, even though the odds seemed to be against this thing occurring. Okay, here's Angus with his 6th graders. He's in the back there, looking very serious, actually. And he attended this same school where he taught as a high schooler, and he was deeply influenced by a teacher, Miss Eccles, because she was in charge of school productions. And Angus wanted to be very involved in every single school production. He wanted to direct, he wanted to act, he wanted to build scenery, he wanted to do everything. And Miss Eccles encouraged this. She didn't say, oh, Angus, stop. And at some point she says to him before he's graduating, Angus, what are you going to do with yourself? And he said, well, I'm going to go to University of Washington. I am going to get a degree in English, and I'm going to be a newspaper man. And neither his grandfather grandfather nor his father ever encouraged him to be a newspaperman because they didn't make much money. And they wanted Angus to do something better for himself. And so, but this was what Angus said. And she said to him, have you ever thought about drama? Not that you want to be a professional actor or anything like that, but have you ever thought about perhaps you could teach in a school like this and then be in charge of the productions? And he gave that some thought and filed that away in his head. And then it came time to graduate. And his parents came to him and they said to him, you know, Angus, we're not going to be able to send you to University of Washington. We simply don't have the money. And they thought he would be deeply disappointed. But he said, well, you know, I could go to the Bellingham Normal School and I could get my teaching degree and I can make some money doing that. It'll only be 9 months, so it'll definitely be cheaper. And so his parents were very surprised and they said, okay, all right, that's it. That's what we'll do. And so he didn't tell them that he had a girlfriend that was going there. But I think also Miss Eckley's voice was probably there in his mind as well. Anyway, so he did go to the Bellingham Normal School, and he explains that the student population was 900, 800 of whom were women. So his girlfriend got lost in the mob. But he did meet Lois Muzzle in the Bellingham Normal School, whom he married in September of 1926. And she was a very important woman in the development of OSF. The first 5 years, she was the art director, and she did all the scenery and costumes there. So they got married in September. But prior to that time, he was teaching at this school because Lois was finishing up her teaching certificate. And as it says here, he did a play to earn money for the Women's Civic Improvement Club, which was a huge success and it made lots of money. But it made money. But then the following year, he was expecting a contract that he would go back and he would teach. But he never got the contract. So he went to the principal and said, hey, what's going on here? And principal said, I'm sorry, we're not giving you a contract. Well, what was wrong? Well, one of the board members said you had spent too much time in the theater. So he was fired from his first job. So anyway, he and Lois decided they would go up to the Olympic Peninsula and teach at a very rural school where it rains about 110 inches a year. And they did that for 4 years. And then wait a minute, let me see if I can do this. Oh, I don't know. Okay. In the summer of 1930, he and Lois had saved enough money so that they could go to the University of Washington for 5 quarters. And the reason that Angus really wanted to do this teaching was so that he could make money to pursue his theater studies. That was the most important thing to him. Well, in that first summer, he and Lois sat at the feet of B. Iden Payne, who was a British actor, director, and academic, and an advocate for the production of Shakespearean plays on an Elizabethan type stage. He was very influential in Angus's life, as you can imagine. And Angus was so deeply impressed with Payne, and he said, you should write a book about this. And B. Iden said to him, you know, it's not about the reading, it's about the doing. And so anyway, Angus played Boyette, that's him in the rough up there. And it was directed by V. Iden Payne, this production of Love Labour's Lost. And John Conway, theater director, remember that name, who embellished the stage to resemble the Elizabethan theater. And also on this picture on the left is a woman whose name is Virginia Opsvig. And remember that name because she comes up later. Okay, so at the end of the 5 quarters, Angus has completed his bachelor's degree. He's done his coursework for his master's. He only has his thesis left to do, but he's run out of money. He and Lois need money. So he goes to the education department and he says, can you find me a job? And they said, what are you, crazy? It's 1931. You're never going to get a job. And he said, oh, yes, I will. So he found 2 openings, one at Ellensburg Normal School and one at the Southern Oregon Normal School, thanks to his cousin, Henrietta, who worked in the music department there. So he applied to both. And in Ellensburg, he was rejected because he hadn't directed enough plays. Then he's hoping for Southern Oregon. And at the last minute, he gets a telegram and they say, you're hired. Thanks to, of course, a lovely recommendation by his cousin Henrietta. And so he arrives in Ashland in September 1931. Okay, and some of you may be familiar with this story. Of course, there was the Chautauqua Domes, right? Ashland had 3 Chautauqua Domes, and the third one was huge. It had, it could seat 5,000. It could put you could have 700 people on the stage. It had this giant, giant dome. But when the Chautauqua series ended in the 20s, it just fell into disrepair. It became very dangerous. And so they took the top off. So anyway, and the story goes, as Angus tells it, that he and Bob Stedman, a student, were out in a driving rain and they were fleeing the rain. And then they take cover in some basement area within these walls. And they're sitting there and they're thinking, you know, this looks a lot like Shakespeare's 17th century Globe Theater, don't you think? Well, maybe not a lot, just a very tiny bit, a little bit. And they said, yeah. And so they thought, well, we could put a stage in here, couldn't we? We could put it, hey, we could put not just one, we could do not just one play, but a series of plays, because this was where the Chautauqua series was. People would come for 2 weeks, they would stay, they would come and they would see everything. So we could do a series of plays within these walls and continue the tradition. And maybe the city would favor this in particular because it continues a tradition. And so the idea was born to have the first annual Shakespearean festival. And so, but they had a lot of work in front of them, and they had to talk this up. And so Angus could talk, and he could build community, he could build support, and between the students, the colleagues, the community members, all through the valley, this is what they did. At the same time, his parents were up in Portland at some kind of event, and they ran into an Oregon Journal newspaper person, and they said, hey, you should go down to Ashland because our son's starting a Shakespearean festival. And he said, okay. So they went down there, did an interview with Angus and a lot of other people, and went back and wrote a story that said, you know, Angus has this brilliant idea to do a Shakespearean festival in Ashland and make Ashland the Salzburg of the West. And I think he can do it. So it was this really positive article. And of course, the local newspaper man came and said to Angus, why'd you let him scoop us? And Angus was probably, oh, so sorry, wink, wink. He always felt that if the coverage outside the area would spur more coverage locally. So he was very conscious of the role of PR in building the support for the festival. So the city fathers agree. And because, you know, Chautauqua started around the July 4th weekend, also those series, I think the first one started July 5th. So they started, this was going to be part of the 4th of July weekend celebration. They were going to have 3 days. So they were doing 2 performances of Twelfth Night and 1 of The Merchant of Venice, but they needed a stage. So entered John Conway, and that original design that Angus, that stage that Angus had been on in 1930 with Beide and Payne, and they kind of tried to replicate that. And because this was occurring for a community holiday, a WPA supported work crew helped build this stage. The city of Ashland was its sponsor, and they supported that. And so they all worked like crazy to make this happen. But then at some point, the city council, of course, gets cold feet. There's no way these plays are going to make money. We're not going to meet budget. Oh, no. And so they say, Angus, how about we have some boxing matches? And Angus is like, well, sure, that's really Elizabethan. Why not? And so the crazy thing is so over the 3 days, they're going to have 42 rounds of boxing matches. I always wondered, where did these guys come from? And well, there were a lot of conservation corps. Yeah, the Conservation Corps was around. Anyway, the CCC camps, Civilian Conservation Corps, thank you. They had a lot of camps around. And so they got all these guys from the CCC to do these boxing matches over the 3 days in the morning. And also the PR guy from the CCC comes and talks to Angus and says, I want to do your PR. This is so great what you're doing here. This is like the perfect example of man bites dog, the story that shouldn't happen. I mean, you're going to do a Shakespeare theater in the middle of this place? So, and so they did. Here are those boxing matches, by the way. As you can see, they're all sitting out there in the hot sun in July, watching the boxing matches. And probably because of this hot sun and other things as well, the plays not only paid for themselves, but they paid for the losses of the boxing matches. And so, of course, then Angus could note with pride that Shakespeare would and could be an economic asset to the community. So they had their season in 35 and in 36, and each year they grew a little bit and they increased their profits some. And in the end of the 36 season, they had a big profit of $84. And Angus went to the president of the normal school and said, hey, can we take this, because the normal school had sponsored the second year. He said, can we take this money and put it in a special fund for next year? And the president said, well, because we've now unified with the rest of Oregon, we can't put it in a special fund, but we could put it in the general fund and earmark it. Okay. So 37 comes around and that $84 is gone. And so that was when Angus decided, you know what, if we're going to be the Salzburg of the West, we have to be able to control our own finances. And so that is when they incorporated, yes, they incorporated as a nonprofit educational institution, which also meant that they had a board of directors as well and could manage their own money. So that's 37, 38. 38 was kind of a tough year. 39 was even worse. They weren't getting the people that they wanted. And Angus was thinking, this has something to do with what's going on in Europe. There's a war brewing in Europe. And he went to the board and he said, I don't think we should have the festival in 1940. And they said, we disagree. We think we're going to have it. And he said, I don't want to be the producing director of a season that loses money. And so they parted ways. And Angus decided not to be the producing director in 1940. At the same time, he and Lois were having some domestic issues. And so they ended up getting divorced in May of 1940. She stayed for that 1940 season. Angus decides, and then eventually she goes to Hollywood down to work. And then Angus decides, well, what am I going to do? So he writes a play. And he wrote a play and submitted to a competition at Stanford University. And his play was one of 10 that was accepted. And so he decided there was a conference that summer and he would go down there. And so he went to that conference in 1940, and that is when he met Dr. Marjorie Bailey. And he was so impressed with her insightful, incisive comments about his play and about Shakespeare and about so many other things. He thought, I have to come back here and take some classes from this woman. And so He will do that, because when Angus thinks something, he does it. So he and Lois are divorced. He learns while he's down there that the festival has lost $300 that year. He learns too that the festival stage has been heavily damaged by fire. That is so, but in 1941, he marries Gertrude Butler, who lives in Medford here, and she was a clerk in the county offices. And he and Gertrude remained married for the rest of his life, and he calls her my memory, my detail man, my secretary, my other self. Okay, now we have the war comes on. And in 1942, Angus entered the Army, and he soon becomes a supply sergeant at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He also, first he was in like the 86th Division, and then he's assigned to the 104th Division. Well, in early 1944, the Army decides that anyone over 38 should not be going to the front line. They would be sent to work in essential war industries. And so Angus is 40 at the time. And so he's sent to Santa Monica to work with Douglas Aircraft. And it isn't until later that he learns that all those guys that he'd known in the 104th Division, when they were sent to Europe, and in the first day they were there, they were in the Battle of the Bulge, and all of them were either killed, captured, or wounded. So Angus, though, in Santa Monica, is making, of course, lots of connections down there with people in film and TV and theater. And he returns to Ashland in 1945. And he looks at that damaged stage and he thinks, well, it was a noble experiment, but I don't see this going on. I don't see this happening. But in 1947, the Ashland City Council comes to him and they say, you know, we want to restart the festival. And Angus says, no. And then he thinks about it again and he goes back to him and he says, I'll do it if you pay me $1,000. And so this city agrees. They pay him $1,000. And so, of course, you have to fix the stage. And so they use the remaining $700 of the war bonds that they have from the 1,000 because they'd lost money in 1940. And then with many, many community donations, lumber, plumbing supplies, plumbers, electricians, just everybody pitched in. They get this improved theater, the 47 stage, built again from plans drawn by John Ashby Conway, modeled on the 1599 Fortune Theater. And it has a bigger 4 stage, as you can see. It's got some side stages, and then there's a backstage. But it did need a new roof. And so that would cost $1,000. So Angus went to the city council and said, hey, will you pay for a new roof? And they say, if you stay here for the rest of your life, we'll give you the money. And he says, well, I don't know that I can actually promise that, but if this is a success, I'll probably stay. And so they agree. They'll pay him $1,000. And Elmo Stevenson, who is the president of the college, I guess it was at this point, he says, okay, I will hire you every summer so that you have a job and an income that way as well. So it was agreed. And then they have a 1947 season. And this, as you can see, it was still very rudimentary. There wasn't much room backstage. And what Angus realized when it started, that 47 season, he said that the community work to rebuild the stage was far more successful than the performances, which he said were bad and some of them excruciatingly so. So given that they were so bad and not, that they really, he wanted so much to make this something better than it was. he decided to take advantage of the GI Bill. So he went back to Stanford and he decided to study, he wanted to study under Dr. Marjorie Bailey, which he did. And the thing that he says this whole year, he said it was so fortuitous that he made this decision. And he said it helped him sort out the more modern views of theater and the real function of theater and why, and it helped him understand why he felt that theater was so vitally important to the world. He believed that. And his studies helped him understand that. And also, remember that young woman at the end of the stage in that one photo, Virginia Opsvig? Well, she's now Virginia Kerr, and she's the head of the costume department there. And Angus was delighted to see her. He took some of her classes and he learned much from her, but also many of her students came to OSF during the summers to work. One of them was Douglas Russell, who came for 13 seasons to be head of the costume department. After 13 seasons, he goes back to Stanford to teach, and his students come to OSF to work in the OSF costume department. He also, of course, Dr. Marjorie Bailey herself will come to the festival, and she will act, and she will be the director of the Institute of Renaissance Studies. He also meets Bill Patton, who comes in 1948 to be the lighting technician. And he will come each year after that. We'll talk more about Bill. And then, of course, Richard Hay comes in 1950 as a technical director, and he is there every year for the most part and becomes OSF's principal theater and scenic designer. And of course, I have to mention as well that Shirley Douglas came in 1958 to act, and shortly thereafter became Shirley Patton. So there's Bill himself right here. He came to resume his technician duties as well as acting. But what Angus learned in the years, a few years that Bill was there, that he was very good at PR. He was very good at managing things. Angus was very impressed with Bill. And at the same time, well, this was all going on, Angus was having difficulties with the board. They weren't staying on their side of the fence. They were saying, hey, why are you bringing in these actors from other places? We want people, don't you know people come to see people that they know from the community? And so Angus is like, that may be what you want, but that's not what I'm looking for here. So, and then they had this big fight about scholarships, and that they were willing to give scholarships, the board was, to directors and technicians, but not to actors. And Angus could not understand this. And so they give scholarships to football players, why not actors? And finally, there were some changes on the board, and Angus was able also to convince them that there was a lot of competition out there. There were more Shakespeare festivals in the world. There was a Korean War. There was a need to give money to these folks so that they would have a desire to come to Ashland, Oregon. And so finally he won the fight, and they got 10 scholarships for $100 each. And when he was writing his memoir here in 1974, he was talking about how there were $150,000 worth of scholarships for any non-staff folks that came to OSF. And then, of course, by the mid-'80s, OSF signed an equity contract, so the whole scholarship thing was abandoned. Okay, then, much to Angus's happiness, in 1953, Bill Patton was named by Angus, the first full-time paid employee at OSF. He was the general manager. Angus was especially delighted because now Bill could present policies to the board and work with the board, among other things. Okay, now, I don't know that I mentioned this, but when Angus first got to Southern Oregon, the Southern Oregon Normal School, he was deeply disappointed that there was no theater department, there was no theater, there was an auditorium, but it was being shared by the music department and everybody else. And so he wanted to have more flexibility. And he'd always thought about the folks out there in the valley and other places that were reluctant to go see Shakespeare plays. Like, they wouldn't understand them, they were boring, whatever reason. And he thought, well, if I could get them to see a non-Shakespearean play, then perhaps they will love these actors, and then they will come to see the Shakespearean plays. Enter Jim Selleck, owner of the Varsity Theater. He noted, as the caption says, that when OSF box income rose, so did his own. There wasn't competition here. It wasn't like somebody was taking their stuff, their people away from them. It was everybody benefited. So he said, hey, Angus, you want to use the Lithia Theater? And he had 2 theaters, and he didn't use this one, except when some competition came to town. And so he offered this for free. And Angus was thrilled. And they decided that, well, okay, we'll call it the Vining Repertory, because the Vining brothers had built this theater in 1914 and it opened in 1914. And but then of course, Angus realized, how are we going to do this? We have no money, because the festival board wouldn't fund it. The normal school wouldn't, or I guess it was the college, the college wouldn't fund it. And so he and Richard Graham put in another director there, put up $2,000 and to make this work. And everybody did everything to make this work. They directed, they acted, everybody, made scenery, made costumes, whatever it took. And they produced 4 productions in November of 51, 4 in the spring of 52, 4 in the fall of 52. It worked each time. It got better and better and better. But in 1952, Angus got a call in the November month of November. He got a call at 2 a.m, and they said, you better come down here. The Lithia Theater was on fire. And so they were all standing out watching the Lithia Theater burn to the ground. And the Lithia Theater used to be right next to the Elks building in Ashland. It's where there's a bank that changes yearly. So it was saddened everyone that this had happened. But what Angus learned from that was that people were interested in non-Shakespearean plays and non-summer productions. And a lot of people kept saying, Angus, when are you going to revive the Vining? When are you going to revive the Vining? And he said, when we get a theater. But first, a new Elizabethan theater, because in 1958, the fire marshal condemned the 47 theater. They kept adding things and doing things because it was the fire marshal would come in every year and say, you have to do this and this and this. And finally, the fire marshal said, you are not doing any more productions in here. So they knew they needed a new theater. And excellently timed, Richard Hay got a Fulbright scholarship to go to England as a technical director at Bristol University. And he was also gathering ideas about the design of an Elizabethan theater. And so he continued doing that when he returned to Ashland. But the thing was, they had to build this theater and they needed a lot of money. And Medford residents Alfred and Helen Carpenter, and if you were here last month, you learned about Helen and Alfred and their how important they were to the Valley in so many ways. And they were incredibly important and supportive of OSF. And so anonymously, Alfred and Helen said, we will match every community dollar that you raise. And so in the 1959 souvenir program, Angus writes a thank you to all the people that donated, because they were from all over the valley, all over the state, all states, even from Canada and other places. And so, and of course, the generosity of the carpenters to match all these dollars. And so it took 11 months to build this, and they opened in July 1959. But there were other needs. There was a lighting board of $50,000 that was required. And also Bill Patton was having Bill's office was down in, I feel like I'm sitting here in Ashland at the Ashland Library. Anyway, Bill's office was in what they called the Mark Anthony at that time, the hotel. Dr. Marjorie Bailey was doing her classes down at the Episcopalian Church and the Ashland Library. And so everybody was everywhere. And so they needed money to pull this together. And so Angus was really concerned about this, $50,000 for a lighting board, and we have to have a lighting board. But Bill, calm Bill, said, well, we can do this. And so, they went to the carpenters came through again, and they said, we will. They also needed an enlarged costume shop, and that was kind of important there, because the carpenter said, we will fund the costume shop remodel if you go into debt for the lighting board. And Angus was a little concerned about this, but Bill took the risk, and they got the lighting board, and of course they paid off the lighting board. And because they were able to pay off the lighting board, then Bill was like, okay, we can go into debt to buy that property where they now have the administration buildings, so they could pull people over. So Angus not only was grateful to the carpenters for funding that theater, but also for showing OSF the way to financial independence. So here is your finished look. And of course, they say the paint was drying on the facade, still drying when people came in. And I think that's true of every theater that was built at OSF. So the fabulous 50s and the soaring 60s, that was the days of the Come 4 Days, C4 plays, really. But look at the problem here. They're doing so well that by 1968, 11,000 would-be theater goers were turned away. And so you can't exist that. You can't survive. And so by 1966, they realized we need a new theater. We have to have one. And so the new theater was going to be a 600-seat theater indoor. And again, thanks to Alfred Carpenter, who was chair of the fundraising campaign. Helen had died in 1961. So he was chairing the fundraising committee, and they raised more than $1 million, well, almost $1 million by 1968. But the sum was half of what they needed for the entire plan. So they needed, again, to enlarge the costume shop, because now you've got two theaters. So you have to enlarge the costume shop. You need a place to build scenery. So they wanted to buy what is now the Black Swan. They wanted to remodel the administration building. They wanted a new exhibit hall in the administration building. And so Angus said the lack of money was extremely traumatic. But again, Bill Patton, he comes up to the plate, and he finds out that Ashland at this time in 1968-69 is deemed economically depressed. by the federal government. And so OSF is eligible for a Economic Development Administration grant. And they do a matching grant of $896,000. But in a strange twist, because this new theater was going to be built on city property, they can't give the money to OSF, they can only give it to the city. And so, almost done. But so what they decide to do is they're going to give all of the real estate holdings and all of the funds for the theater to the city. Give it to the city. City receives the funding from the government, and then the city and OSF negotiate a long-term lease for the lands. And this was not without controversy, but that's another story. And but eventually it works out, and they're on their way to breaking ground and having a new theater. And so the question is, how does the theater bear Angus's name? Again, Julie Carpenter Dougherty. She says, I want to give you a sizable gift for the building campaign, $50,000, if I can have naming rights. And so Angus says, well, you're going to have to talk to the board about that. And so she does. And so she talks to the board, and the board says, okay. And so she names it after Angus. And she said later, I think you were afraid I was going to name it the Carpenter Theater. And he said that would have been fine, but she named it after Angus. And so then we have, again, Richard Hay, amazing designer. He designs this stage in a very modern way to create a very intimate 600-seat theater where actors and audience are in the same space. And it's a beautiful theater, really. And he also was responsible for tying the Elizabethan and the Boehmer together. And so I'm at the end of my talk here, and we come to the end here. Did you ever dream it would come to this? All my dreams are open-ended, which I think reminds me of the swing story and Angus's capacity to envision, believe, and move forward.